Okay, switching to English. So this talk is about a funny fact about Koryak relative clauses. In Koryak, when the relative clause appears at or near the left edge of a sentence, two cases can occur on its head. The first is the case assigned by the matrix verb. I'll call this the external case and mark it in red, and I'll also mark its assigner in red. So this is, for example, in one dative case. So the sentence is, I will not approach the wolf that is howling. So approach takes an object in the dative. But the head can also be marked by the case assigned by the relative clause internal verb, which I will mark in blue. And I'll call this the excuse me, the internal case. So in this case, since the relative clause is the wolf that is howling, is an intransitive verb, what is relativized as the subject of the intransitive, this can be absolutive. And we see the same thing in 2 with something like the woman that woke me up, or the women that woke me up sing well, where the external absolutive or the internal ergative are both permitted. Now, the fact that these case options don't appear to be due to any differences in surface syntax is sort of notable. So in both cases, the head is to the left of the relative clause and it triggers agreement on the matrix verb. And this phenomenon, as probably many people know, is actually found in many languages, sorry, and it's called inverse case attraction. So this is by no means exclusive to Koryak. Now, the fact that it seems to involve an externally headed relative clause, despite the fact that the relative clause head has internal case, has actually puzzled linguists since Roman times. So the Roman grammarian Donatus, who apparently spoke a Latin that did not have inverse case attraction, reports sentences from like Virgil and Plautus and stuff with inverse case attraction as errors. It was only in the early modern period that it was noticed that these errors were actually due to the presence of a relative clause. And this topic has not been subject to a lot of syntactic work, but what has been sort of argued about is that either this involves externally headed relative clauses with some extra phenomena, and we'll talk about what exactly this extra thing is, or that it actually involves a correlative. And based on data from Koryak, I'll argue against both of these proposals. And what I'll show is that the head of a relative clause with inverse case attraction is actually internal to the relative clause, but in the left periphery. Whereas when there isn't inverse case attraction, what we have is actually an externally headed relative clause. So all available data from other languages with inverse case attraction either supports or is consistent with my account of the Koryak facts. And the conclusion then is that inverse case attraction is due to a type of relative clause that has largely escaped syntacticians' attention. These are internally headed relative clauses with left peripheral heads. These are, however, found in the Gur languages of West Africa, but crucially, there is no case in Gur, which I suspect is why there has not been a unification of left-headed internally headed relative clauses and inverse case attraction in the literature. So on my view, languages with inverse case attraction are just languages with Gur-like relative clauses that happen to have case-marked nouns and relative pronouns. So let's look at briefly look at the previous work. The majority opinion is that inverse case attraction involves an externally headed relative clause with something extra. So either a process of case transmission from the pronoun to the head, either a process of long distance case assignment, or a sort of different view coming from Deal that these are derived by head raising and involve left dislocation. What I'll show is that relative clause heads with inverse case attraction are inside the relative clause. So these are not externally headed, and therefore the fact that they have internal case is unsurprising. And this essentially obviates the need for any process of case transmission or agreement or long distance case assignment, which is a welcome result. And I'll also show that left dislocation is at least not required in Koryak and suggest that this is a point of parametric variation. And against the minority view that relative clauses are correlatives, I will show that according to 4 tests that sort of seem to be pretty, very robust tests, robust properties of correlatives cross-linguistically, these do not pattern like correlatives. So let's talk about inverse case attraction in Koryak, which I guess I didn't mention this in the last talk. This is a Kamchatkan language, Northern Kamchatka, with maybe 700 speakers across all dialects. So let's look at example 3. One thing that the examples 3 to 5 show us is that the relative markedness of the internal and external cases doesn't impact the availability of ICA. So this is crucially unlike direct case attraction, which is affected by relative markedness. So for example, in 3, we see that in something, we can have external dative and internal absolutive, or external narrative and internal ergative, where the external case is more marked than the internal case. In 4, we see that we can have external absolutive and internal ergative, or external ergative and internal narrative, where the internal case is more marked than the external. And we can also have a situation where they're both dependent and therefore equally marked, where one is dative and one is ergative. This is in 5. One fact that we will come back to, and is shown in 6, is that the relative clause with inverse case attraction must be in the left periphery of the sentence that it occurs in. So if we say, I did not give candy to the woman that scolded you, and we have the negative particle uire coming before the entire noun phrase, we can only get the external dative case, and the internal ergative case is banned. And the same is the case if we have a pronoun before the relative clause, or if we try to put the whole relative clause phrase after the verb. Only the external case is allowed. So I'll argue now against the externally headed analysis of inverse case attraction on the basis of 2 sort of diagnostics that differentiate inverse case attraction from externally headed relative clauses. The first is extraposition. So Koryak does allow extraposition, but crucially only if the relative clause has the external case, not if it has the internal case. So if we look at 7b, we can say the girl is laughing at me that I gave candies to, but only if girl is marked with the ergative case that comes from is laughing at me, and not the dative case that comes from that I gave candies to. And 8 shows the same thing with 2 other cases. So what this suggests is that there is a tighter relationship between the head and the relative clauses, and in the relative clause in cases of inverse case attraction than otherwise. The other relevant difference is relative clause internal scrambling. So only in cases of inverse case attraction can relative clause internal material scramble across the head. So these sentences are kind of hard to understand if you're used to other languages that are not Koryak or have inverse case attraction. But if we look at 9a, the word order here literally is, yesterday the woman who scolded me, I will see tomorrow. And here, yesterday is interpreted inside the relative clause. We see this because it's incompatible with the adverb tomorrow, but only in case the head has internal case marking. So if it has the external case from I will see the woman, this is ungrammatical. 9d shows the same thing, excuse me, with a locative adjunct. So literally, at school I will see. At school the woman who scolded me, I will see outside tomorrow. So since a pre-head modifier can only be interpreted inside the relative clause if there is inverse case attraction, the scrambling facts show that the head is actually inside the relative clause when there is inverse case attraction, but not when there isn't. So the summary then of this part is that these cannot be externally headed because their head is inside the relative clause, right? The head can be interwoven with relative clause internal material. They're not in situ internally headed relative clauses, since the head has to precede the relative pronoun and it occurs in the left periphery of the relative clause. Instead, what I claim is that these are internally headed, but the head sort of ends up in the left periphery. And I guess if you believe in the movement theory of relative clause, it doesn't move out further, or this sort of depends on your analysis of externally headed relative clauses, which I am agnostic about. And then the extraposition facts follow automatically, since you can't extrapose a relative clause from its head if the head is actually inside the relative clause. I'll now argue against the correlative analysis of inverse case attraction. And so there are at least 4 differences between relative clauses with inverse case attraction and correlatives. The first is that with inverse case attraction, we permit stacking of relative clauses, whereas this is banned seemingly for semantic reasons with correlatives. So if we say something like 10, the food that I ate that you added salt to is tasty, where the external case is absolutive and the 2 internal cases are instrumental and dative, we can get the external case. We can also get the internal case of the linearly first relative clause. What we cannot get is the case of the linearly second relative clause. You can ask about that in the questions if you want to know exactly. But essentially what we see is that with inverse case attraction in 10, that is to say with the instrumental case on the head, stacking is permitted, which is not permitted with correlatives. A second argument against the correlative analysis concerns the association with indefinites. So correlatives need to be associated with a demonstrative in the main clause. So correlatives need to be associated with a demonstrative in the main clause. And so an example of that is given in 12. So this is literally, which person led soldiers in battle? To that officer, Lenin gave an award. What they do not allow is to be associated with numerals, but relative clauses with inverse case attraction do allow this. So in 13, we can say something like, I will meet two people that I gave candies to, where this is picked, the relative clause is picked up by a numeral in the main clause, which is not a property of correlatives. So in summary, the tests show that noun phrases with relative clauses that have inverse case attraction on their heads don't pattern like correlatives and instead pattern like nominal relative clauses. So the summary here is that then these are neither externally headed nor in situ internally headed nor correlatives, but instead a type of relative clause that is internally headed, but where the head is in the left periphery, but not so high that you can't sort of interleave it with other relative clause internal material. So I'll present an analysis of this. I think it sort of falls out straightforwardly from what I've said. The idea here is that, since the head is in the left periphery of the relative clause, the exposition facts fall out automatically since the target contains the head. And the head of a regular externally headed relative clause, so that is to say one without inverse case attraction, only appears to be in the same position as the head with inverse case attraction because it's at the edge of the relative clause. So only the scrambling data allows us to see that the head with inverse case attraction is slightly lower than the externally case marked head. Now, since these are not correlatives, I take it that these have nominal material above the relative CP. And I also assume that the head of the relative clause with inverse case attraction needs to move into a specifier of CP, and that the relative pronoun moves into a lower CP. This is not super well supported, and I think nothing goes wrong with the analysis if you don't accept this part of it. But sort of just as a way of sort of computing the analysis, I adopt these assumptions. So let's consider the structure of two relative clauses. One in 15, which doesn't have inverse case attraction. So this is shown in 16, where what we have is the DP woman who moves from the subject position of the embedded verb into the specifier of a lower CP. And then from there, there is some relationship between the head, woman, which is external to the relative clause, and the position inside the moving DP. And so, like I said, I'm agnostic as to whether this is one of head raising or copying or whatever. As far as I can tell, the Correlatives data don't allow us to make a decision as to whether these involve head raising or not. Now, 17 does have inverse case attraction. And here the only difference is that woman is still inside the relative CP. So it actually moves along with who and then excorporates from that DP into a higher CP. And so, this poses no problems for analyzing the scrambling of relative clause internal material above the head, because that stuff can just target an even higher CP. So needless to say, I assume that you can just sort of generate CPs when you need them. One thing that I haven't said much about yet is the relationship of the whole noun phrase with the relative clause to the rest of the clause it occurs in. So we've looked at the internal structure of inverse case attraction, but not at its relationship with the rest of the clause. And unfortunately, I don't have anything very satisfying to say about this. So recall that the noun phrase with the relative clause with inverse case attraction must be in the left periphery. So it cannot, if you have inverse case attraction, so for example, 19a, if you have the negative particle preceding the relative clause, you cannot have inverse case attraction. You have to have the external case. B and C show the same thing with other verbs.
5 minutes left from the presentation time.
Thanks.
Of the presentation.
That being said, it doesn't need to be immediately clause initial, and this is a point where there is some interspeaker variation. So for example, some speakers allow 20a, where an adjunct WH word precedes the noun phrase with, let's use the whole relative noun phrase with or without inverse case attraction. And I think all speakers allow the irrealis negation particle to proceed. Oh, sorry, no, it's some speakers allow the irrealis negation particle to precede the entire relative clause. There's sort of an interesting contrast between the irrealis negation and realis negation that I don't know what to say about too much, except that maybe they're just different projections. So one question is how the relative clause with inverse case attraction gets to the left periphery of the relative clause. And unfortunately, it's unclear. There is inter and intra-speaker variation regarding the island sensitivity. So whether a noun phrase with the relative clause can occur separated from the place it's interpreted by a syntactic island is sort of unclear at this point. Possible, I mean, more work on Koryak, or I mean, maybe more work on Koryak is needed to figure this out. Maybe it's not figure outable, I'm not sure. In any case, what it seems is that there is variation regarding how the noun phrase with the relative clause gets into the left periphery, as well as what exactly the left peripheral position is. All is not lost, though, because I think a cross-linguistic look at the licensing conditions on relative clauses with inverse case attraction, as well as on internally headed relative clauses with XC2 heads, shows that there is, you know, the intra-Koryak variation reflects a cross-linguistic variation. So this is something that doesn't seem to be unified across languages. So the only language where I think this has been fully worked out, or seemingly fully worked out, is Nez Perce. But at least for Koryak, more work is needed to figure out exactly what's going on regarding the relationship between the whole relative clause, the noun phrase relative clause, and the rest of the clause that it occurs. So I'll briefly talk about some data from Gur languages, and I have various appendices with data from other languages that you can ask about. The sort of background to this is that, you know, we might be skeptical about the existence of the type of relative clause that I've argued for here. So that is to say internally headed, but with an XC2, like XC2 internally headed relative clauses. But exactly this kind of relative clause has been argued for the Gur languages of West Africa, where, you know, the head appears XC2, but nonetheless inside the relative clause. So for example, like in Koryak, in the Gur language Buli, the head of a relative clause can be preceded by relative clause internal adverbs, like yesterday. So this example here is 22b, where in the sentence Atim ate the mango that Amuak bought yesterday, yesterday diem can come before the head of the relative clause mango. And I have a variety of argumentation to this effect in Appendix B. So what it looks like is that the same syntax that generates this type of relative clause in Gur is responsible for inverse case attraction in Koryak. And note that in Gur, there is no positional restriction on the internally headed relative clause, which sort of adds another dimension of variation to the cross-linguistic picture. Appendix C talks about this from a variety of other languages, including ancient and modern Indo-European, Uralic, and a couple other families. Essentially, no data that I've been able to find undermines the idea that inverse case attraction is the result of an internally headed XC2 head, a relative clause that is internally headed but with an XC2 head. Although some languages seem to not sort of be informative either way. Oh, there are quite a few languages that pass the same tests as Koryak. So to conclude, I have argued for a syntax for inverse case attraction where the head of the relative clause is left peripheral but still inside the relative clause. And it allows us to capture the intuition from previous literature that inverse case attraction constructions are sort of intermediate between correlatives and externally headed relative clauses. So their correlative-like word order properties are due to the fact that the head is inside the relative clause. Excuse me. Their externally headed relative clause-like word order properties are because the head is pretty far to the left of the relative clause, but not all the way outside of it. The fact that they are not interpreted like correlatives is just because they aren't correlatives. And the fact that they behave for the purpose of external syntax like externally headed relative clauses is because they have a nominal layer above the relative CP. And finally, what I've proposed is a unification of inverse case attraction with the left-headed internally headed relative clauses of Gur, which have no overt case marking. And this is good because it obviates the need to posit any special mechanisms to account for inverse case attraction, like the the sort of relative clause external case transmission or long distance case assignment that have been proposed in previous works. So on this view, languages with inverse case retraction are just languages with Gur-like relative clauses that happen to have case marking on the nouns and the relative pronouns. Thank you. You are muted.
Ваш включи микрофон.
Sorry, thank you so much for the talk. And now we have time for questions. And Polina was the first to raise her hand. Yeah, Polina, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. I have a question about, like you mentioned Hill-Murray among the languages that fit your analysis.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, so like what I know about Hill-Murray is that inside the relative clause itself, there is a relative pronoun that is marked, and the head, which is the noun. Maybe I missed something, but like, how can the head be both like ex situ internal head, which is the noun, and have this
relative pronoun?
Relative pronoun, yeah.
So I guess this is similar to the analyses of externally headed relative clauses in languages like English, that like at least the which relative clauses, let's forget about that relative clauses for a second. So if we say something like suddenly I'm blanking on how to do a which relative in English. The book which you brought with you is interesting or something, right? I mean, one of the analysis there is that, or at least one of the analyses is that which and something, either an operator or the book, start as a constituent, it moves, and then you delete book essentially somehow. So either book moves out of the relative clause, or you just don't pronounce it under identity with the head, right? So the idea is that here you just don't delete the internal thing and you don't realize it externally. So in a sense, sort of what Koryak and other languages have is a sort of it's sort of the underlying version of what, for example, the head raising analysts say English has. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And other comments or questions? Well, I probably have a question that doesn't lie in the like syntactic sphere, but still, if we think of it as probably a pragmatically driven phenomenon, then we would expect that different cases would behave differently in terms of the acceptability for the variation, like for the availability of external case that different cases would differ in that respect. Do you see any differences between the cases, or are all the cases interchangeable in that position?
As far as I can tell, all the cases are interchangeable in this position. So most of my examples, I mean, okay, so already saying how many cases there are in Koryak is possibly a fool's errand, because there are all these forms that you can get. But I have tested this sort of extensively with nominative, ergative, dative, locative, narrative, and instrumental. So at least with those 6, I don't find, I haven't found any effects like about the which case it is that you're using affecting the availability. But yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah, we might predict something like this, but I haven't found evidence of it. It would be interesting if, say, like the equative case weren't allowed. That would require some more thinking.
Thank you. We still have some minutes for questions. Well, if not, then we'll probably just wait for 2 minutes until the time of the next talk will comes. And thank you so much for the talk again.